Imagine you're walking along a road on a hot summer day. It's high noon, and there's not a cloud in the sky. You're walking along the rural countryside. Fields and forests line each side of the road you're on. Looking off into the distance, you see something white standing in a nearby field. It's difficult to make out because of how it's catching the sun, but it looks almost like a person, and they're moving from side to side, swaying unpredictably, dancing almost. But there's no wind blowing. Whatever it is, it's moving on its own. Do you try to get a closer look? Or do you keep going down the road and hope it hasn't noticed you too? Whatever it is, maybe it's better you don't know. Good evening, travelers. My name is Anunnaki, and in tonight's Spook Stop, we're taking a look at the Japanese legend of the Kunekune. The Kunekune is a mysterious entity seen in rice fields, typically around noon on very hot summer days. They're pale white like paper and vaguely humanoid but lacking in distinct features. Their notable behavior is how they seem to sway and meander as if blowing in the wind, even if there is no wind at all. The name Kunekune is a Japanese onomatopoeia for the action of wiggling or twisting, because of the way the creature is said to move. This name is also used for a breed of pigs, which actually makes searching for this myth difficult if you don't specify that you're looking for the myth. It's only dangerous when approached or observed closely. The Kunekune will ignore those who ignore it. There are many variations of the legend of the Kunekune, all of which are vague on what the entity actually does to attack or what it actually looks like. This makes sense as the most important element is you're not supposed to look at it or get too close. It's believed that the story of Kunekune was first written on the internet board 2chan, or Ni-chan, in 2001, under the title, "You're Better Off Not Knowing." This original story was stated to be a work of fiction, as that was the prompt for the thread on 2chan. Users were encouraged to write some spooky ghost stories. The story was fairly well received and inspired others to write and share similar stories of the Kunekune, leading to several variations. It's important to keep this in mind. For all intents and purposes, Kunekune is just a creepypasta, a made-up story on the internet. A variation of the story was reposted in 2003 on 2chan's occult board, where it lost the disclaimer saying it was fiction. This incited many readers to believe it was real, and the story was spread with this new belief in mind. With that said, what are the original stories? The first important detail to discuss is the setting. If it wasn't already obvious, this story is always set in Japan, and as such, it's usually said the Kunekune cannot be found anywhere else in the world. In particular, many versions set the location somewhere in the Akita prefecture. Located in Japan's northwest coast, Akita is known for cold winters and hot summers, has a significant coverage of farms and rural areas, and in particular is famous for its rice farming. The name Akita means autumn rice paddy. Not all of Kunekune stories take place in rice fields, but most do, such as the most common story, which generally goes as follows. Our unnamed protagonist, a young boy, and his brother visit their grandparents that live out in the countryside. Sometimes this visit is for Obon, an annual festival in mid-August. It's notably hot and sunny the day of the visit, which prompts the brothers to go for a walk outside. Sometimes in the story there's an eerie, warm wind that catches the brothers off guard. As the brothers approach a large rice field, the older brother sees something strange in the distance, which appears to be someone standing out in the field. The younger brother, confused, asks what it is. The older brother realizes what it is and simply tells him it's better he doesn't know, and urges him to turn away or go inside. In some tellings, the older brother needs a pair of binoculars or similar to get a closer look at the figure. before realizing it's a Kunekune. The younger brother attempts to look too, but is stopped either by the older brother or by the arrival of their grandparents or guardians who take them back inside. The older brother by this point is a nervous wreck, strongly affected by what he saw and unable to describe it. But the grandparents understand it's because of the Kunekune. The conclusion of the story is usually the same, where the older brother inevitably loses his sanity and sometimes is unable to return home with the younger brother because of it. Other stories take place on a beach or seaside setting, where the Kunekune is instead seen standing out over the ocean. In one such story, the protagonist is at summer camp for swimming lessons, but everyone is made to stay inside due to typhoon weather. The protagonist and his friend are looking out their window and spot the Kunekune. The protagonist here has poor eyesight without glasses, and therefore doesn't get a good look at it, while their friend does, and subsequently ends up going insane and is forced to drop out of the swimming lessons. Many interpretations see the Kunekune as a spirit or yokai, a supernatural entity whose whole mysterious existence is based on its observed behavior of dancing in rice fields. However, there's a couple more ways to look at it based on some details found in certain versions of the story. For example, sometimes the protagonist is visiting family during Obon, an annual Buddhist event for commemorating one's ancestors, whose spirits are believed to temporarily return to the world in order to visit their relatives. This suggests that the Kunekune is similarly a spirit returning to Earth during the brief holiday, or more sinisterly, it's the angry ghost of an ancestor returning to either bring harm to the living or just to frequent the land they may have previously owned. I think the most disturbing reading of Kunekune is that each instance was once a human being who had transformed after seeing another one and subsequently lost their mind. In one version, for example, the Kunekune is clearly a man in a running suit, who has seemingly changed or started acting like the Kunekune. In the story where the older brother starts to lose his sanity, some tellings go on to say that the brother began dancing and moving in ways that matched the Kunekune seen earlier. The grandparents recognize this fact and keep him in the countryside, saying they'll eventually release him to the fields after a couple years. What I find most upsetting about this is not the tragic loss of humanity in the affected individual, but the prospect that it can spread like an infection. The older brother needs to be kept away from the city to reduce the risk of him turning others into Kunekune like himself. In fact, it reminds me of a real-world phenomenon known as dancing mania. The most famous case occurred in the city of Strasbourg, Alsace, in 1518, when a woman by the name of Frau Trophia began to dance fervently in the street. This unusual act would turn bizarre as Frau continued to dance for days on end, and other townsfolk joined in over time, all dancing uncontrollably. It's said that after a month's time, over 400 people had fallen victim to the phenomenon, and a debated number succumbed to heat exhaustion, dehydration, and even heart attacks due to the dancing taking precedence over everything else. What's more, the dancing plague started in the hot summer month of July, continuing through August, another odd similarity shared with Kunekune. Ultimately, the plague and many others like it are explained as mass hysteria, a social phenomenon where people act irrationally and it kinda spirals out of control. Even though it started as a work of fiction, some people claim to have had events where they've spotted a Kunekune. So, besides just a weird dancing guy, what other things could be mistaken for this bizarre creature? The first most likely candidate is your run-of-the-mill scarecrow. The practice isn't necessary or typical for rice farms, but it's not unheard of. There could totally be a scarecrow dressed in all white, just kinda moving in the wind, even if the people looking from afar can't feel said wind blowing. There's also loose folklore in Japan that scarecrows are able to come to life at night, or if stared at for too long, and it's very possible that elements of that myth just rubbed off here. There's even a legend that the first scarecrows used in ancient Japan were live humans, usually criminals or people useless to society, who were tied to poles or posts in fields instead of paying a worker to stand in or patrol said field. Another thing I'd like to bring up are wick drains, which have the same kind of appearance as a kunekune. These are objects that can direct the flow of water in order to dry out large areas of soil, as rice paddies sometimes employ irrigation and flooding to deter pests. Another possible culprit could be a mirage or heat stroke. The latter would explain why it can only be seen in the distance during very hot days, and why its sighting is followed by a person losing their mental faculties, if only temporarily. Yokai and folklore traditionally serve as rudimentary explanations for a range of different phenomena, so it makes sense that the same ideology would apply here and create a monster that symbolizes and explains heat strokes. Realistically, anybody who claims to have had a real encounter with the Kunekune are either telling a tall tale or are genuinely mistaken about what they encountered. Another very obvious reading of the myth is its use of what's called the motif of harmful sensation. Basically, a writing trope in which something is able to hurt you in some way because you observed it. Some famous examples of this are the myths of Medusa and the basilisk, which will cause certain death to anyone who looks into their eyes. It's not always a visual phenomenon. For example, the song of the siren is said to be fatally hypnotic to sailors who hear it. Technically speaking, this isn't constrained to the realm of myth and fiction. Many things in real life are able to harm you in a similar manner. Sounds at certain frequencies, sometimes those inaudible, can cause headaches and nausea, and those with epilepsy can be harmed by observing rapidly flashing lights. Perhaps my favorite is something called the elephant's foot, a large mass of highly radioactive black corium created by the Chernobyl disaster in April of 1986. At the time of its discovery, it gave off enough radiation to kill you in only minutes. So much as a glance with no protection would leave lasting damage of radiation sickness or cancer. Now, the only real harm mentioned in observing the Kunekune is progressive insanity. This trope is popular in a lot of early creepypastas, likely stemming from the works of H.P. Lovecraft, in which many characters lose their minds after encountering some otherworldly horrors. It's important to note that in H.P. Lovecraft's work, the insanity isn't the result of some sort of mental attack or magic or whatever. It's a reaction of trauma that essentially leaves the victim with some degree of PTSD. There's of course plenty of things in real life which can cause this kind of trauma. It's interesting then that observing the Kunekune has the same effect. In the stories we see other characters like the grandparents who certainly know about the creature already, but they're not traumatized by it. Something about its appearance must be more upsetting than anything you can imagine. And we've imagined some pretty scary stuff in the world of horror, but nothing so frightening as to completely render you insane. So by comparison, our wiggly friend must be very, very ugly up close. Today, the original author of the story is unknown, so it's impossible to know exactly what may have been their inspiration or intended meaning behind the story. So next time you find yourself in this familiar setting, you might wonder to yourself whether there's a dancing figure just over the horizon. Just don't go looking for it, because you'll be better off not knowing. I hope you all enjoyed the episode. If you did, then please be sure to subscribe, as well as hit that bell so you don't miss future uploads. If you have any ideas for future episodes you'd like me to do, let me know in the comments below. Until next time, this has been Zenonaki, and I thank you all for watching The Twilight Road.